Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Power Retail's Fireside Chat, powered by global chain-link solution provider Adyen. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm Prinitha Govender. I'm the editor of Power Retail, and I'm joined by Brian Dammeir today, who's the head of product at Adyen. Before we kick things off, some quick housekeeping for you. Mobile phones, if you could please turn these to silent. You probably want to pay attention this afternoon because we've got a great session ahead of us. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions. You can enter these at any time at the question dialog box on your dashboard, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Got a big session this afternoon, so get comfortable, guys. Today, Brian will help you understand how to maximize the value of unified commerce by data, reduce friction online to increase store loyalty, track, manage, and prevent fraud, as well as linking data from all channels for effective marketing and customer relationship management. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Brian, today we're talking about unified commerce and how modern day shoppers don't see different channels. They actually see a single brand, which is why unified commerce is so important for retailers today. I think first things first, can you please provide the audience with a one-on-one on what unified commerce is exactly?
Absolutely. I think what the industry is sort of grappling with right now is this sort of omni-channel world they now have, or this omni-channel opportunity rather. I think the last 5 years or so was about creating an omni-channel proposition as a retailer, right? Having these various different channels through which customers can reach you through. And for the most part, retailers have obtained that. And I think unified commerce is actually taking that to the next step and actually using the information and the data and the opportunities that having those multiple channels presents, and using that in ways to simply make the experience of the user better, whether that's delighting them during the checkout process by recognizing some aspect of their loyalty, or really brass tack stuff like fraud prevention and loyalty tracking. I think if you look at sort of the omni-channel opportunity, obviously, we look at this as sort of a multi-channel setup. And as you can see here, this is your standard omni-channel proposition, one of which Adyen as a payment service provider offers, of course, right? You obviously have standard web. You have two sort of flavors of mobile, which is mobile web and mobile in-app. And then, of course, you have traditional point of sale payments.
So, Brian, how does Adyen actually see the distinction between mobile in-app and mobile optimized web, and which approach should merchants go for, and how does it affect how they would build an omni-channel app?
That's a good question. I think it's sort of the perennial debate. To what extent does a brand have sort of enough sway with the consumer that they would want to download a separate app? And I think every retailer needs to ask themselves that, right? I think at the end of the day, the data does show that an app, as opposed to mobile optimized web, simply drives more engagement. That being said, there's significantly larger development resources necessary for that. And then there's the fundamental question of whether or not your customer base actually wants to interact with you in that way. What I do think is important, and I do see this all too often, is that a retailer will have two different mobile channels. They will have their mobile web channel and their in-app channel. And due to the realities of developing those at separate times, oftentimes they'll be separate infrastructure, separate data sources, separate payment processors. And as we talk over this topic of unified commerce, the more you separate those data sources, the more work you're going to have to bring them together in the future. So I would say that if you are going to have multiple mobile channels, both in-app as well as mobile optimized web, that you ensure that they are connected sufficiently. I do want to take just a moment, though, and talk about sort of some of the omni-channel opportunities, because, well, I think a lot of retailers have implemented these already, and we're already moving on to sort of next steps, which is unified commerce. I think it's just really important to note that it's still worth talking about what an omni-channel proposition looks like and the different flows that you're able to provide with that. I think here sort of shows a few examples of various different omni-channel flows. One of course is click and collect, where you buy online and pick up in the store. Another is returns. So buying online, returning in store, buying in store, returning online. And then, of course, there are various different endless aisle solutions in which you can buy and store and receive at home as well. One of which I use quite regularly at most of the retailers here in Amsterdam where I live.
So, Brian, outside of payments, what do you think merchants should consider when implementing these kind of omni-channel solutions? For example, endless aisles.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's one that we grapple with quite a bit with our retail partners. Generally speaking, from the payments perspective, these sort of solutions aren't difficult to build, right? You can have some sort of experience in store, which then indicates that something should be shipped offline. Like from a payments perspective, that's quite simple. You collect data from the card, either in the terminal or collect it as an e-commerce payment, and that payment can go through. And we, as a sort of omni-channel unified commerce payment processor, don't have any issue with that. I would say the largest challenge when it comes to building out an omni-channel flow is definitely maintaining your inventory and your warehouse management. If that piece of it doesn't work, obviously you can't build out these flows. And I think the reality is that most omni-channel efforts on the retailer side aren't so much a payment initiative. That's obviously a key part of it. They're more an initiative around unifying the management of inventory across those different channels, which it tends to be, I think, the much more difficult and substantial project when it comes to building out anything omni-channel. So I think it's worth then reiterating then what we think unified commerce is, right? So if omni-channel is building these different channels and these capabilities, unified commerce is actually connecting the underlying data between those channels and recognizing shoppers across those channels seamlessly, which at the end of the day is the point of the entire exercise. Now, from an Adyen perspective, being sort of a modern payment processing platform, we use data science across the board. Whether we're using that just for auth rate optimization, for fraud prevention, or for building out unified commerce tools, we see this simply as a data problem, or rather a data opportunity. From the Adyen perspective, we basically use a rather advanced linking algorithm to link all of the transactions that we see for a particular user. So regardless of the channel that they're coming at you with, we will link those transactions together accordingly, so that as opposed to treating a shopper like 2 or 3 different shoppers because perhaps they use a guest checkout in one scenario and maybe they used 2 different cards in store, we can use sort of like 2 different types of linking attributes to link those together. The first is high value tokens or credit card aliases. And these are basically identifiers that represent that card but aren't the actual 16 digits. So you can do that in a PCI compliance manner. And this is sort of your basic level linking data point, right? The payment method. At the end of the day, the consumer only has so many payment methods. And if you can see visibility on those payment methods as they go to you via different channels, whether it's mobile optimized web, their app, in-store, et cetera, if they're using that same payment method, you should recognize that as the same payment method regardless of the channel and be able to connect those transactions together. And then, of course, you can get into much, much more advanced linking techniques, linking on things like the delivery address, email address, and phone number. And I think the thing that gets challenging there is that those can be shared, right? You can have shared delivery addresses in an office space, for example, which is when you have to start using more advanced linking techniques as opposed to the more basic level tokens and aliases. And
can you please explain further what a high value token is, or a card alias, and how are these useful for retailers?
That's a good question, and I think it really just gets into the technicalities. A high value token identifies that card, and with that token, so if it's a string of numbers and letters, let's say in this case, if you give that string of numbers and letters back to your payment processor at any point, you can actually use that to do a new transaction. It is truly card on file. You're keeping that payment method on file. And you can do a transaction, you can send an unreferenced refund to it or a referenced refund. It's basically usable again. Whereas a card alias is sort of a more rudimentary token that for any given 5 transactions using the same card, you will always get that alias back, but the alias isn't intended to be used in the future as a way to start a transaction. So at the end of the day, you can do the same thing with them in terms of linking transactions, but a high value token is much more usable with your payment processor in the future and can really help you do things like, card on file flows and whatnot. So taking a step back, I think you then need to think of this as sort of an overarching data project, right? We hear a lot about data lakes, right, or data moats. There's a lot of terms that get thrown around the data science community. And basically, the entire point is that you want to get a unified data set somewhere. Once you get that unified data set in one place, you can use it for all sorts of purposes, whether it's marketing, creating insights, personalization, fraud prevention, so on and so forth. So I think there's sort of like two core things that are then required to appropriately set up that data lake. The first, obviously, is the payment method information. So that's the storing of payment-centric information. That's those encrypted token pans and high-value tokens that I just talked about in the previous slide. And then, of course, you have equivalent reference numbers for non-card payments. So at least in the Eurozone, there's an IBAN, which is the bank account number, and then you have just sort of standard bank account numbers in other regions. So this should be your bare minimum, right? At some point, you should have your CRM, which is your understanding of each user, and at the very least, tying together their transactions with the payment methods that they've used. Now, if you can augment that with substantially more shopper-centric information, that opens up a lot of possibilities in the future. So identifying the various different login identities for those users, the delivery addresses, phone numbers, IP addresses, et cetera. And the more you can get this into one unified place, the more use cases that you can make out of it. I think the most interesting is sort of some of the marketing use cases, which we'll go into fraud prevention use cases later. But I mean, think of the scenario in which you can quantify across all of your different channels what users went to a store at least 3 times in a month, as well as shopped online at least 3 times in a month. That's a highly, highly engaged multi-channel user. And if you're going to want to market to that consumer very differently than you would market to someone who's never been online, only been in store, and possibly only goes to the store once every 6 months, but perhaps spends significant amounts when they do, right? These are two very different shoppers, of which once you create this data lake, and your payment processor can be a key part of having that central data that helps you identify who is who across those channels, then you can really start marketing to them in a bespoke manner.
And can you explain a bit further how a merchant would augment their already existing CRM and with this kind of data, and where should they start?
Yeah, when it comes to augmenting CRMs, it's all about what you've already collected. I think it really runs the gamut. You have sort of high-end retail where there's this very high-touch experience, right? You're asking the person their email address, their phone number. They do customized, personalized shopping experiences. And because of that, they usually have like a really good wealth of information about the consumer. So in that, adding payment information to that is just sort of icing on the cake. And in fact, you're just going to want to attach those card details to those already existing CRM points, the points that you have in the CRM, and then use that as sort of your central, right? So if you already have that information. If, however, you're sort of any other type of retailer, for the most part, you've probably collected very little, right? You've collected decent identification online, right? You at least have an email address and some delivery address and things like that. But then it's more than likely that your offline channel, your in-store retail, hasn't collected significant information. So in that, actually, you can see the collection of payment information as the beginning of actually identifying who your shoppers are in store and starting to connect those to who your shoppers online and combining those entities and basically expanding on what was basically an online CRM to include offline in-store behavior.
And to give more insights to merchants who aren't already leveraging unified commerce data, what kind of insights are merchants generally looking at first when building these kind of these sorts of data sources?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, right? I mean, you have the data lakes, then what do you want to do with that? And I think my first answer would be that every merchant already knows what insights they need to get, right? Because they know what's important to their business, right? If you're if you're high-end retail, you want to focus on people that come often and spend a lot, right? These very, very, very loyal shoppers that you want to give white glove service to. If you're more traditional, faster retail, you want to identify who comes to your store more often, but then not necessarily spends a lot on all of those goes. And then in some businesses, actually, identifying who your omni-channel shoppers are. So your most loyal shoppers across all channels is actually most interesting because they tend to be the customers that have the best ROI. Now, from an Adyen perspective, from a payment processor perspective, we've built out reports that are really focused on giving sort of shopper-centric information. And we can only do so much, right? Because we're creating a generic solution, whereas merchants would want to dig into their own specific metrics. But we've tried to identify some key metrics that we think all merchants would find value in. That includes simply for a given time frame, and you can see a screenshot of the reporting here. For a given time frame, how many unique shoppers did you have out of number of transactions? Of that, what are the average transaction values? We do things like the number of shoppers per channel. So we break it down into e-com only, store only, and omni-channel shoppers. We do give a breakdown of new and returning shoppers by channel in that period. So who are brand new entities and who are people that are returning? If one of your initiatives as a company is to get more return shoppers, then this gives really insightful information. And then lower down in the report, and we don't have this on this slide, unfortunately, we actually give information on who the high returning shoppers are. So you can quantify, I want to know in this given time period who shopped with me at least 10 times and give a breakdown of who those shoppers are. And if you're one of those retailers who's looking to give that sort of white glove service, I think that's extraordinarily important. So I think the main takeaway here is that, once you have unified commerce insights and data, it's up to you to do what you want with it. I think you should really see it as sort of two phases of an overarching project. The first is to simply establish that data lake, that place where you have an understanding of who your shoppers are across all channels, how often they're shopping, what they're spending, what they're buying. And once you have that, you more or less just farm that data out to whoever it matters to within your organization, whether that's marketing, whether that's the payments team, whether that's the fraud prevention team or the insights team, et cetera. And from there, the opportunities are really significant. And I think one of the opportunities that we want to talk about today is how you can use unified commerce data to stop fraud. Actually, my background is in fraud prevention. I did fraud prevention at Google and Airbnb prior to coming to Adyen a few years ago. And therefore, this topic sort of has a special place in my heart. But I want to reiterate that the whole point is that unified commerce data can be used across multiple faculties. So using it to stop fraud is just one example amongst many of what you could do. I could easily spend the next 5 to 10 minutes talking about how you would use it to marketing, for marketing as opposed to for fraud. So I'm going to break down sort of 3 use cases that are relatively straightforward, but I think they're just examples of how you can use unified commerce in this context. I think the first one is probably the most straightforward. So using customer location to identify possibly fraudulent transactions. If you can quantify a latitude and longitude for every transaction, and this isn't relatively difficult, right? So if you have an online transaction, it is pretty easy to turn that IP address into a location. It might not be as accurate as a street corner, but it will certainly be as accurate as a city or a greater urban area. Generally speaking, for any point of sale device, you understand where that transaction is taking place because you know where that store is located. So in that, you tend to have a decent heat map of what a consumer's behavior usually is, right? For example, here we have a picture of a standard San Francisco consumer. There's 3 locations that they tend to buy from in terms of in-store transactions in green. And then we can see where their online transactions land in yellow. And we can see, generally speaking, the behavior of this shopper is in San Francisco. Now, if we saw someone leveraging that shopper's card details or using their account from a dramatically different location, let's say we were seeing a online, in-store transaction in Kansas, for example, that looks suspicious. In the online space, so if you're talking about web, that's extremely suspicious. And it indicates that the card details might have been stolen. So while we would never say that you would want to use a rule like that to just simply block the entire transaction, it should go into a larger analysis of the fraud likelihood of that transaction, being able to compare the sort of omni-channel unified commerce heat map of a user and then compare that against a transaction coming in is extremely powerful in preventing fraud.
So how can merchants get their fraud systems to do this kind of assessment? Can they do it on their own with their current partners? And if so, how can they do this?
Yeah, so I mean, it really comes down to two things. A, can you get the location for every transaction? Can you get a latitude and longitude tied down for every transaction that you have, whether that's in-store, online, in-app mobile, mobile optimized web? That's step one. If you have that, you have the building blocks. However, if you can't tie that all together into who that shopper is and do that in a very quick and scalable way at the time the transaction is coming through, then the data is relatively useless, right? So I think more rudimentary risk systems would simply do that on the card. They would keep a heat map of the card and say, here's the behavior that we usually see. And don't get me wrong, that goes a long way. I think more advanced risk systems, and Adyen is included in this, do that advanced linking algorithm that I talked about in one of the previous slides, where in real time as the transaction is coming through, that transaction is tied to a shopper in the algorithm. So it might be that a new card comes in, but then is automatically tied to an already known existing shopper. And in that, you're getting much more information than the more rudimentary card-based approach. Or perhaps it's a new shopper and the algorithm identifies that and it's identified at time. So to repeat, I think there's two components to that. The first is, do you know the location of every transaction? And then the second is, how are you going to tie those together? What's going to be the unifying force? Will it be the card itself or this more nebulous shopper identifier that your fraud system might leverage, of which device fingerprinting might be a part of that as well? I think the next example we have is quite interesting from a retail perspective. So, we talk a lot about omnichannel here, about unified commerce, and how the whole point is that you're combining in-store transactions and online transactions. But in fact, I find that with a lot of retailers, in particular ones where they mostly care about their in-store retail, it's actually about having visibility between their retail locations in real time that matters. I think a lot of retailers, their payment systems just sort of, every store is sort of acting in a unique way against the others. They don't really communicate with each other at all. It's more or less that each store is acting in a bubble. And since we are a unified system, that's not really a constraint that we have, right? Since day one, we haven't really done anything like that. We've always assumed that you would want a holistic picture of all of your stores. So one of the fraud attempts that we see sometimes is what we call road trip style abuse, where a particular fraudster is attacking a particular entity, and they'll go to all the stores in a given area and they'll try that same technique. I think a really interesting one would probably be EMV chip and pin fallback. So in most scenarios, you get 3 attempts to make the EMV chip work, and then you can fall back to Magstripe. And this really depends on the policies of the merchant and whether or not they're going to allow that and all sorts of things. But it's a common abuse vector that the fraudster will basically scratch out that chip so it doesn't work, do the 3 dips, get the Magstripe fallback, and little do you know that it's actually a stolen card or a fake card or something like that. And because you did that Magstripe fallback, you don't have the liability shift that you would have enjoyed using chip and pin. So actually what we're able to find is not only are we able to identify that particular technique is being used, and we can block that in real time, but we can also share that across stores. So if we see that a fraudster is just using a few different cards to do this abuse and driving up and down the peninsula in the Bay Area and doing that, we can actually ramp up the risk scoring as we see that abuse vector because we know it's happening in that area. So while it would potentially just be identified as risky but still authorized, maybe in the initial transactions, as we see that there's this cascading effect as the technique is tried more and more in that area, we might go so far as to, and this is based on the merchant's configuration, block the transaction as it's going through.
So how do you actually handle the in-store transaction interaction when you suspect fraud is actually occurring? Brian?
I think this is the $1 million question, right? From a technical perspective, we're quite able to say, hey, we think this is fraud, here you go. It depends on the policy of the retailer, and the policy of most retailers is that first and foremost, there's no formal indication that fraud is occurring to the terminal and to the cash register system. In fact, it just sort of shows up as declined. And the whole point of that is that you don't want an interaction about that particular topic in the store, whether it's just from sort of like a customer experience perspective. In the case of false positives, you don't want to tell someone to their face that you think they're a fraudster, as well as to just reduce any sort of conflict that might occur. So most merchants do want us to simply and rather we send back the fraud response, and then they usually convert that in some way into just sort of a generic response, or we can provide that in a generic way as well. That's most policies. I mean, some policies really call out and give a lot of freedom to the clerk or the agent in store, and it really depends on your philosophy and how you do training and how you want to take that approach, with your policies in store. And then the final example, and I'm going to be pretty transparent. I think this is by far the most interesting. I mean, we could talk all day about stopping fraud, but at the end of the day, in-store fraud is relatively low. I mean, obviously you have traditional risk vectors like theft, but due to chip and pin and all these different sort of advances, stopping fraud in store, while important, probably isn't as important as actually reducing friction online. This is probably the biggest impediment that a lot of loyal shoppers have. I like to give first an example, right? Let's say you have sort of a consumer that falls outside of your normal online consumer user base. Let's say it's a 63-year-old woman based in New York, right? And she has consistently every year spent $5,000 or more at you as a retailer. Now that's excellent. You have a very loyal customer, but you have a single channel customer, and at the end of the day, that's fine, right? Some customers really only want to interact with you in one channel, but our data does show that an omni-channel customer on aggregate will absolutely spend more. The more opportunities they have to spend with you, the more money you're going to make working with them, right? So let's imagine this woman, right? She often doesn't buy online, but she's going to give this a chance. So she spent thousands and thousands of dollars with you. She goes online, and due to any number of reasons, whether it's putting in her CVC wrong, AVS data being wrong, or just any number of sort of funky looking indicators, the transaction is blocked. I would say that this is sort of the worst of the worst scenario. You have an absolutely loyal customer in store that you have treated very poorly online. You would never, if that person walked into the store, say, turn around, go back outside, right? You would know their face, you would know who they are, they're a loyal customer. So one of the powers of unified commerce is actually that there is not this distinction between the data sources you have between these channels. So if someone has spent $5,000 in store in a year and they go online, you've already identified that that's the same shopper using the card details and other identifiers. That's already tying together in your either an Adyen shopper DNA system or in your own CRM. And then on the fly, as that risk assessment is happening for that transaction, you can dramatically lower the risk score and reduce any sort of blocking, 3D secure, any sort of friction that you might offer in a high risk scenario. You can forego that in this case because you know that it's an extremely loyal shopper. I would say that out of all the stuff that's coming out of unified commerce from a fraud perspective, using that in-store loyalty to give online loyalty identifiers and thus reducing friction is probably one of the most interesting things that we're doing today.
And Brian, what is actually necessary to use in-store data to help with reducing friction offline, and what actual data points are crucial to pull this off? Do most merchants have access to this kind of data?
That's a good question. It really comes down to your fraud system, and I will point back actually to my answer in one of the previous questions. Right, it really comes down to do you have that thing to tie transactions to? The other example was, do you have the location and that thing to tie it to? This is actually a much more simple question. You don't even need the latitude and longitude and the IP addresses and all that. You just need to know that, here are all the transactions for this shopper, right? So let's say shopper A. And then as transactions are coming in, can you in real time tie those transactions to shopper A? Whether shopper A is identified simply by just using the card details or using the card details along with all sorts of other identifiers, the way you do that doesn't really matter. And I think a lot of systems, whether it's a payment processing system or a fraud system, will take different philosophies. We've done a transaction linking algorithm. Others might do more rudimentary approaches. That doesn't matter. What does matter though is two things: unifying across that identity of the shopper and doing that in real time. Because if you can't do it in real time, then it doesn't really matter for that real-time transactional use case of fraud prevention, as well as other real-time use cases. So from there, I just wanted to give a very, very brief breakdown before we go into the Q&A of the Adyen solution, if you're not familiar with us. In short, Adyen is a unified platform providing payment services across all channels, right? Obviously, based on the topic today, we do in-store payments, we do online web, we do in-app payments. And that's part of it, right? We're one unified platform that does all of those things. So you have unified integration, unified reconciliation, everything is unified on one platform. But I do think it's worth also noting that the approach that we've taken with building a payment processing platform is very, very different than the traditional way. It is worth noting, you'll see in the top of the diagram, the traditional value chain, which is, you have a gateway provider, a third-party risk system, which points to a processor and an underlying acquirer, which then eventually goes to the schemes. And we see this sort of a lot of very, very good gateways sitting on top of very, very old infrastructure on the processing and the acquiring side. And the way that Adyen has differentiated itself is by tearing all that out and building everything ourselves. So between when the merchant sends us a transaction and when we are sending it to Visa, MasterCard, and the various other schemes, it's all Adyen technology underneath. It's all been built in the last 5 to 10 years. It's built on the best technology. And there's a lot of things we can do with that. Most of it is data oriented, right? So we can provide rich data insights. We can provide that frictionless shopper experience. And we obviously have global reach all in one platform, as well as just sort of the standard stuff that you get with a new modern platform. Things like uptime, things like accuracy in the responses that you get, and the breadth of the data that you receive in the auth response, as well as the ability to do the advanced things that we do around linking, used for fraud prevention, as well as unified commerce data. And then finally, I think this list of merchants that we currently work with speaks for itself, right? I think it's really interesting that we bridge the gap between sort of your very large tech companies like your Spotify's and your Netflix's, as well as your traditional retailers like your Tory Burch's, your L'Oreal's, your Crocs, Under Armour, et cetera. And I think we're taking many of the advantages that Silicon Valley has found a new unified platform and giving those advantages to the retail space as well as the unified commerce space. So from there, I'm happy to roll into a Q&A session with our remaining time.
Excellent. Well, it was an absolute pleasure discussing unified commerce with you and uncovering, some of Adyen's insights on fraud prevention and boosting customer loyalty and the many benefits that come with unified commerce. We've got a few questions queued up from our audience this afternoon. The first one for you, Brian, comes from Miles. Miles wants to know, does Adyen indemnify against fraudulent transactions when a merchant deploys their fraud prevention tools?
I'm not sure what that's asking. All I will say is that, we have our standard setup, which is, oh, okay, I think I do know what that's asking, but I will say that there's sort of like two setups that we have. We have our standard setup, which is our unified sort of, you take the Adyen box and you just run with it. And part of that is our fraud prevention suite. And you can use that fraud prevention stack that's built into the platform and use that as your primary fraud prevention engine. We work very actively with Adidas, for example, to do the majority of their fraud prevention. You then can also come with your own third-party risk system. Whether that's built in-house or a third party, you can make those calls to that third-party risk system and then make the appropriate payment calls to us. And we have plenty of merchants that do that as well. The one thing that I will notice, I think it's a pretty common theme in retail right now, the topic of chargeback guarantees, of which we as Adyen don't provide because we don't think it sets up merchants and us as a provider to have the right relationship and the right incentives to help each other. But there are plenty of third-party risk systems that will offer such services. and you can make those calls yourself, and then they can hook into our dispute APIs so that if they need to identify which transactions resulted into a dispute or into a chargeback, you can do that. And those, we more or less can work quite actively with systems like that.
Excellent. I've got a question here from Brenton. He wants to know, how does Adyen fit in with buy now, pay later services, as well as services like PayPal?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, we offer PayPal as a payment method like any other. And then if you're talking about, buy now, pay later services, I think there's two flavors of that. There are actual payment methods that offer that as their key proposition. And we don't just do card payments. I want to be very clear. We offer over 200 local payment methods, whether that's PayPal, Sofort, Alipay, WeChat Pay, GiroPay. I can name a bunch. Across the world, there are various flavors of local payment methods or payment methods in general that really just focus on offering that pay later functionality. And I think most merchants usually go with those to start with because it's the easiest. You just offer it as a payment method. The consumer understands why they use that payment method, and then the risk assessment is done with that payment method. We also do offer a self-service model. So if a merchant does want to more or less extend credit to the consumer, do a risk check themselves, send out the goods, and then bill them later, we offer all the rails in which they can do that. We also offer various connections to sort of third-party credit agencies so that they can look up whether or not the consumer is creditworthy. I will say that that's probably on the much more extremely advanced side of things. Most merchants tend to go with those payment methods that are focused solely on offering buy now, pay later options, and then they might move in the future into offering invoice themselves.
So Brenton has replied, that's excellent, thank you. That's his message to you, Brian.
Awesome.
Got another question here. How can I make unified commerce data consumable by other organizations within my company?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I think many people in their professional lives have found themselves in a scenario in which they had this awesome data set, and then they didn't know how to get it into the right hands, right? I'll come with a little bit of personal bias, right? I think a good business intelligence platform of some sort goes really, really far within most organizations. Because at the end of the day, most people don't know SQL or SQL. They don't know how to program, but they do know how to put together insights. And I think in the last 5 years, there have been humongous leaps and bounds in business intelligence platforms. Tableau is probably the most well-known. Looker is another interesting one that we use at Adyen. The entire point of that is that you basically create an interface in which people can drag and drop things, create things like pivot tables, charts, dashboards on the fly, and then come up with those insights on their own. So whether or not you consider that part of the scope of your role to go so far as to build the data and then make it usable, I think really comes down to your organization and what you already have in place. But I will say that if you can connect it to whatever business intelligence suite you as a company use, then you'll start seeing it used outside of your organization in those other cross-functional organizations that you work with. And as such, it will be much more usable.
We've got another question here for you, Brian. Do we need to be concerned about PCI compliance with this, the data that you've discussed today?
I think that's actually a really good question. And there's a reason why I used the phrase token throughout the presentation, right? I am assuming here that at no point do you as the retailer receive back a PAN, the 16 digits. And that should be sort of like basic for any payment processor that is taking the PCI compliance burden on behalf of you, right? For the solution of Adyen, for example, obviously we can do pure API if you as the retailer or the merchant are PCI compliant. However, most are not. So then they choose to do encryption with us. So we encrypt via a secured field solution, a hosted solution on the client side. Those details then go direct to us, and then we will only ever communicate to you with that token. So if you're only being communicated with the token and never the actual underlying card details, PCI scope is very, very minimized. If you're talking to partners and they're saying things like, we're going to send back, the card number to you and you can store that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that dramatically expands the scope of your PCI compliance burdens. You should watch out for solutions like that.
And I think we've got time for one more question. How do I get a unified commerce initiative off the ground? And what is the first thing to ask of my provider?
Yeah. So, you want to do it, but then how do you convince your boss, basically, right? I think first and foremost, Adyen has the numbers to show that once you're able to identify who is a single channel versus a multi-channel shopper, you will make more money with that information, because the simple reality is that a multi-channel shopper spends more, is more loyal, and can be targeted more specifically. So I would say the business case really hinges on that, being able to make the case that if we can identify these people that are not single channel shoppers and market to them and treat them accordingly, that the net gain will be extraordinary. I think the first question you should really be asking your provider is, can they do this, right? Across your channels, can they tie that together? Can they say, this transaction in store is using the same payment method and appears to be the same shopper as this transaction online? If they're able to do that, excellent. You have all the building blocks necessary to do this sort of thing. If they're not, I would say you may need to talk to a new partner, of which Adyen could be one, of course.
All right, and one last question for you, Brian. Can you please talk more about the distinction between a high-value token and a card alias?
Yeah, so I think I broke that down before, but it is getting pretty technical and in the weeds. I think, and unfortunately, the industry hasn't really unified across terms that are specific, right? You hear token thrown around a lot, and there's various types of tokens, but it's just sort of this generic term. It really comes down to, there's two types of things that your payment processor can return back to you. They can return back a token that's really only intended to represent that card number and never be used again, but rather be consistent across transactions. And in that, and why we use the phrase card alias, is that it's really just an alias that represents that card. A token implies that you want to use it multiple times. So a high value token is something that not only represents that card, but can also be used in the future for future transactions and card on file. At the end of the day, your payment processors should be able to provide both back to you. They both have unique use cases as well as advantages and disadvantages to each. But if both could not be returned back, I would say that is a pretty decent sign that they might not be ready to offer the sort of unified commerce experience that you want to build.
Excellent. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Just wanted to extend a warm thanks to you, Brian, for such an insightful presentation, some great content in there. And also, I want to thank everyone, our audience, for joining this valuable fireside chat today. The video for this will be available online soon. And please sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already signed up for any upcoming webinars that could be of help to you and your business. Brian and I are signing out for now. I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thank you much, everybody.